people signed up, and right now people are still kind of funneling in. So we appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day, and hopefully you can hear a few talking points or a few ideas and best practices that you'll be able to take back to your community and maybe improve your own floodplain management program. We do hear more and more, it seems like, in the news about flooding events, whether it's around the country or worldwide. So it is a pretty relevant topic, and unfortunately, I don't think it's an issue going away or reducing in any way. But we hopefully will give you some best practices to help your community become more resilient and plan for future environmental changes. So today, just some housekeeping items. I think we're all pretty well versed in these webinars by now, whether it's Teams or Zoom. But today's webinar is being recorded. We're hoping to post it on the Office of Planning and Development website, as well as the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services YouTube channel. So the first 40 or so minutes will be a facilitated discussion with the panelists after I give my little spiel here. And at the end of this, we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions from the audience. We do ask that you hold the questions until that time. And it'll be pretty obvious when that happens. I'll make it known. The chat is open if you're having any difficulties or technical issues. And Kirsten, if you could enter your email into the chat. If anybody gets kicked out or anything really, please email Kirsten Howard at the email in the chat with questions. And during the question and answer portion, again, use the chat or the raise hand function, and we'll hopefully get to everybody. Great, thank you, Kirsten, for that. And after the panelists, it'll be followed by a presentation from our friends and colleagues in the Office of Planning and Development, Katie Paight, State Floodplain Management Coordinator, and Jennifer Gilbert, who is the Director of the Office of Planning and Development. It'll be a similar question and answer system. Please hold the questions until the presentation is completed, and we'll leave time at the end for attendees to ask any questions of them. And Kirsten just entered her email into the chat, so that is great. And with that, we'll plug on forward. So today's agenda, welcome and overview, we're going through that right now. Panel discussion, and we still got people coming in, and Q&A. Great. So I'll introduce myself first. My name is Brendan Lynch. I am the Resilience and Flood Mitigation Specialist with New Hampshire DES Coastal Program based out of Portsmouth. My primary role with the Coastal Program is to coordinate the Flood Smart Seacoast Project. It's a grant-funded project and a coordinated effort between state departments, including Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and the Office of Planning and Development, who has representation here today. It also includes the regional planning commissions around the coast, Stratford and Rockingham. And the idea is to build regional capacity for greater coastal community, environmental, and social resilience in New Hampshire. We do this by providing direct assistance to help coastal communities incorporate best available coastal flood risk science in decision-making, adopting higher floodplain management standards, and a big key is accessing FEMA funding for these resilience projects. However, floodplain management is not just a coastal issue, so we're happy to see a wide range of representation from throughout the state today. A big focus of the Flood Smart Seacoast is public outreach and education and planning for these future environmental changes. This education includes the floodplain management practices and how to create and maintain an effective management program at a local level. Whether you're a coastal community or inland community, these programs can be difficult to get started and maintain. Today, our goal is to identify and explain these intricacies, challenges, and best practices. So hopefully you can identify and improve some of your own practices in your own community. So with all that being said, I'm happy to introduce our lovely wide-ranging panelists from today. And with that, I'll run down the three of you. And when I call on you, if you could just give a brief rundown and background of your experience as well as your role in floodplain management within your community. Um, so we'll start. David Robbins, Planning and Zoning Administrator from the town of Lyme.
Hi, good morning. I basically started out as a programmer in GIS and took a job as the planning administrator for Lyme. And so I've kind of learned as we go along, but my kind of focus has always been on GIS, as that's my background. So I try to do as much as I can with our GIS system to try to manage the floodplain, manage any of the issues, locate buildings, potential buildings, that kind of thing.
Great, thank you. And next we have Kim Reed, who's the planning administrator from the town of Rye.
Yes, thank you very much, Brendan. My name is Kimberly Reed. I'm the Planning and Zoning Administrator for the town of Rye. And I started in 2006 and we were part of the community rating system. And my first day I was handed the file saying, here you go. So I got a very unique opportunity. I want to see it as an opportunity. I would go down to Emmitsburg. I did the training to learn how to be a certified floodplain manager. I took the exam. Rye currently is no longer in the CRS, but we're trying to get back in. And I have been working since 2006 to really understand the intricacies of how the floodplain ordinance in Rye can better help the residents as we go forward, not only with the new maps, but with the climate change, because as everybody knows or should know that it's not just the ocean, it's riverines, it's from floodplain, it's from your stormwater. So as my role here as the planner, I look at applications that come before the planning board and the zoning board and how do they relate to the floodplain ordinance.
Great, thank you. And Michael Hagan, plans examiner from the city of Keene.
Thanks for having me. I've been with the city of Keene for 22 years. Started as a permit tech, worked my way up to building inspector, to commercial building inspector, to plan examiner. I review all the plans that come in, as well as all the floodplain permits for the city. Been a certified floodplain manager for about 10 years now, and I went to Emmitsburg as well, and great class. If you get an opportunity to go down there and learn, it's well worth it, well worth the trip and the week long. They do a really unique training that I've tried to implement with the New Hampshire building officials with that. So my uniqueness to this group and some of the other panelists is I do the building portion of it as well as the floodplain portion of it. I bring a kind of unique portion to that.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. And last but not least, Jennifer Gilbert, the director of the Office of Planning and Development at the for the state of New Hampshire.
Good morning, everyone. As Brendan said, I'm the director of the Office of Planning and Development, formerly Office of Strategic Initiatives, Office of Energy and Planning. I have been administering the state's floodplain management program since 2005. So I see familiar names on the attendance, and I have worked with my fellow panelists for many years. And I thank them for participating in this. I think all three of you are great examples of what you do as best practices in floodplain management. So.
All right, thanks. And with all that being said, we'll dive into some questions. I'm hoping this can be more of an organic discussion too, and I have a few directed questions for each of you. And if you want to add on to another panelist's statement or you have something to fill in extra, absolutely, please chime in. So great. We'll start with Dave from Lyme. If you could please explain your permitting process, including how and when you make a floodplain determination. And also a great thing to focus on too is how do you document the process and explain those requirements to the owner or applicant?
Yeah, everything starts with having the owners give me a plan with what it is they want to do. And I try to work with the owners, the property owner, to figure out where the development's going to be. And then I base, again, I have a very strong GIS background, so I base my first determinations on our GIS system. I have our parcel maps, aerial photography, some LiDAR data. I have all the floodplain maps, plus a lot of other areas that are specific to Lyme. And I kind of do an overview of all these particular areas in relationship to where they want to put their development. And so I can pretty much locate with the owner where the building is going to be on the aerial photography. We can look at things like how far it is from the edge of a road, how far it is from a building. I can see stone wall with the LiDAR data. And so we can get a very good understanding of where a development is going to be and then compare that to the floodplain maps. And in most cases, it's fairly clear whether it's in or out. If it's not real clear, we may ask the landowner to have a surveyor come in and establish exactly where the floodplain begins and ends and where the building is so that we know. If the building is then in the floodplain, then we open that discussion and say, okay, there's more requirements that need to be met. We also have the discussion of, is it possible to move that building or that development outside of the floodplain? Lyme is kind of unique in our zoning, is we have quite a few overlay districts. So you may look at a floodplain. For us, mainly it's along the Connecticut River Valley. A lot of that area is farmland, and we have a conservation district for agricultural soils. So not only are we dealing with having to look at where things are in relationship to the floodplain, but in relationship with some special conservation districts, which, floodplain is one. We have another one for agricultural soils, one for steep slopes, one for ridge lines. And so we look at all of these and see what affects the property and what affects the new development. We can then have a discussion whether we can go to the Zoning Board of Adjustment for any relief. If that's possible, then great, we can have that conversation. If not, then we have to talk about either developing elsewhere or what types of things they have to do, especially the floodplain, to make sure that the new development is in compliance. I use a lot of the booklets that are provided by FEMA that talk about what those requirements are, what types of floodproofing. And then as far as documentation, we try to keep all those plans, any of the floodproofing that they decide to use, we keep all that information all stored in paper files. We do not have a building inspector in town, so we are limited to what we call a zoning permit. We can't do a building permit because we have no inspector to actually inspect structures. So it is basically left up to me to make sure that when buildings put in place, that it's in the right place. So I'll go out and look at the structure, look at the measurements, make sure that things are in the right place. And I try to do that in stages. Look, if a foundation has to be put in, I try to go look at the cellar hole, look at that location, look at the foundation itself, all to try to make sure we catch anything ahead of time. So that's pretty much our process.
Great. All right. Thank you. And next one is for Kim. Do you have any internal standard operating procedures regarding regulating the floodplain development? some examples: substantial improvement, substantial damage determinations, non-building development, elevation certificates, or flood proofing certificates.
So my role is the planning and zoning administrator, and we do have a building inspector. Both of us are certified floodplain managers, and we do have processes in place. First of all, I'd like to speak to how a project is determined. So usually if somebody is coming in, they either go to the building department or myself and say, this is what we're thinking of doing. And if we go to either the D firms, we go to several different maps. We also have the floodplain maps on our own GIS on our own town server. So we try to make, and as we know, the structures are what is regulated. So you have to look to see, you could have 1 inch on, or you could have 10 feet on, but it's the structure. So we try to say, okay, if say you're going to be demoing and rebuilding, why don't you move it away from the floodplain ordinance? We also have a coastal, like Lyme, we have a lot of overlays. A lot of the development that we see is down by the coast. So we have a coastal overlay district, which also may run in tangent with our floodplain ordinance. So we, a few years ago, had a higher standard of a 2-foot elevation. This is even before the building code came out mandating the 2-foot freeboard. We had already had freeboard in our system. So what we do is we have a process. So if an application, we don't generally allow variances to the floodplain ordinance. We allow variances to side setbacks. We may coastal for height, but since I've been doing this job, we have never given a variance to the floodplain ordinance itself. We try to work so that we don't do that. So what we do is if they come in and they do have something that's going to be in the floodplain, they have to fill out an application with we have a whole process for certified floodplain management application. They have to say what kind of structure it's going to be, if it's a VE zone, if it's a velocity zone, is it an AO, AE zone? And with those come the different standards. Is it going to be on piles, piers? And all of that is regulated by our building department. And they keep very good records. We have color code systems here in the town of Rye. So if it's in a floodplain ordinance, it's an orange file folder. If it's going to get a variance, it's a green folder. But as I said, we don't give variances to the floodplain ordinance. So since we are a coastal town, everybody loves the beach. Everybody wants a view of the beach, even though it's not always entitled. So we have a 28-foot limit, height limit in the coastal overlay district. But then people started saying, well, that's not fair because we're now in the AO zone or the AE zone and we have to go up. So we changed our ordinance. If you're in the coastal flood area and in the special flood hazard area, you're allowed that 2-foot for freeboard if you can prove that it's, for the standards for Rye's floodplain ordinance. And sometimes people come and they want the 10-foot ceilings and it's more for aesthetics. And we're like, no. We're not going to give you a 36 height if it's for aesthetics. And we've seen some really good people build to the standards and get a decent home building within the codes and the regulations. And if it's in the special flood hazard area, we have a minimum 3 inspections. They go out and inspect it for when they do the foundation. And we also have certified, they have to get the, certificates of, not certificates of occupancy, I'm having a brain cramp. They have to go and have it measured.
Elevation certificate.
Thank you, Jennifer, thank you. So they have to have the elevation certificate. So they have to have that at the beginning because we want to know where's that first floor going to be. So it's very well documented through our building department.
Great, thank you. And Kim did mention some higher standards. So Mike, the flood provisions in the state building code do have higher standards than the requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program or the NFIP. In Keene, how do you administer both requirements within your community?
So since I've been here since 2001, we've always had the higher regulatory standards in our ordinance. As you've seen in the building code, or the residential building code under section R322, that gives you the requirements, the new standards or the minimum NFIP standards in the right in the residential building code. Me and Jennifer are still working with the State Building Code Review Board, excuse me, on adopting Appendix G, but it overlays a little bit into zoning, which people don't, a lot of people on the board were concerned about, that it would get into zoning and planning portions with subdivisions and so on and so forth. They may overlap a little bit, but in Keene, we have a similar setup. As you can see behind me, in the gray files are floodplain permits. We have the green files for residential permits, and red for commercial. And then there's obviously new buildings, any new commercial, yellow, any new residential are orange. It helps us delineate, as well as we stamp all of the permits right on the front of the file, floodplain permit, so that anybody looking at that file can say, oh, this is in the floodplain. I need to know, I need to look a little further into it. It helps right off the bat to just plaster it. I mean, it's a big stamp right on the front of the file. It lets everybody know. It's been great over the years to have GIS as part of that, and working with our permitting program of iWorks, it allows us to flag properties. So that automatically comes up as soon as you enter a permit, it will say this is in the floodplain, and it will say this is in the historic district, or this is in the hillside development ordinance, and so on and so forth. So steep slopes ordinance, all the other ones that come along with that, I'm sure you guys deal with, but it triggers it right off the bat. So we know from the very beginning how to start it, and it's been with the help of the GIS technician to incorporate that into our permitting software. So if you have permitting software, they may be able to take that information or that data that's already in the GIS system and put it into your permitting system that allows you to just double flag it, because you never want to miss it. It's always harder to deal with it after the fact. As far as the we require two separate permits. We require a floodplain permit because it requires some specific information. Having a higher regulatory standard under Chapter 25 of our zoning ordinance or our land development code, it's not in our zoning for a specific reason, because we don't issue variances for floodplain regulations. Some of the additional things that are higher regulatory is we do require 1 foot freeboard, but we also require compensatory storage. So compensatory storage is no net loss. So you have to show that any development that you're creating or any rise in elevation, you have a depression on site to maintain that water so that it doesn't change down. It doesn't change the hydrology of the rest of the neighboring properties.
Yeah, those are all great, and seem to be very applicable in other towns. So hopefully people are taking notes. And this next one, this next question is kind of for all three of you. I'll start with Dave, because it is difficult explaining the requirements of these types of applications and these types of projects. In your experience, what are some of the best ways or most effective ways to explain floodplain development requirements to an applicant or a property owner, or even the general public stopping by your office? Yeah, what are some of the good tactics that you use?
One of the best things I have found is, again, having the GIS data available. I can do a very quick map that shows them their property, where the floodplain lies on their property. And that kind of gives them something definitive to work with. Like they're not seeing it as I'm just saying there's a floodplain there. They can see it. And then, like I said, a lot of the books that FEMA provides on how to flood-proof a house. We can sit down and start going through some of the different things that can happen, and then have the conversation about hiring an engineer to actually engineer all of this. That's usually the most difficult part of the task, is to realize that they need to spend more money on the project than they were expecting. And so, try to at least give them an idea of what it is we're requiring and why. When we look at floodproofing, not just setting things up on stilts, but having foundations that can open and close, allow floodwater in and out, showing those types of designs so they understand what's going on, understand that, why the first floor has to be above a certain elevation, why that has to be certified. And so really just sitting down and having the conversation and having some materials to point to say this is how it's done or how it can be done. It gives them a little better idea. It's not this big unknown, and they're not, when they go to talk to an engineer, they've already seen some of these things, and makes a little more sense to them.
Great. And Kim, maybe you could speak a little bit to how you handle the coastal questions.
It's difficult in the coast because we're pretty much built out. And so what we see is that these old cottages, if a lot of people are coming in outside of the town and doing demos and rebuilds, and those are easier because if it's a demo and rebuild, we could say, okay, we treat it as if it's from scratch. And you're in the special flood hazard zone. So this is how you have to build it. And we go over the requirements. We show them what the differences are between AO, AE, and a velocity zone. And we have the maps. Thank goodness, like Dave is GIS friendly. I am not. So we go over it together. And so we look at the maps and we say, okay, most of these people, if they're demoing and rebuilding, they're having an engineer or a surveyor help them as well. So we go over this and say, all right, this is what you need to build to. This is the standard. What we're seeing a lot of is that they're getting these legacy homes. Their grandfather built this and it's been handed down the family, and they don't have a lot of funds, and they're nickeling and diming it. And they're just, it may be in the special flood hazard zone, but they don't have the funds, but they want to bring it up to, maybe not code, but bring it up to certain standards. So I know you haven't talked about it, but there's that 50% rule. So how it works is, if you're going to be doing substantial improvements that are 50% more of the market value of the property, you have to bring the entire home into compliance. And this is what we're seeing a lot in Rye, is they don't want to come up against that 50% rule. So where some people aren't even coming in to get the building permits, we're finding out after the fact, they're doing it covert. They're doing it on the weekends or at night, when hopefully the building inspector's not driving around and catches them. Or they're coming in for one permit. Next year they come in for another permit. And so they don't have to meet that threshold. So those are the procedures and the barriers that we have on the coastal area, is that most of the homes are already built. And so what do? We try to explain to people it's in your best interest, because you don't want to have a home, and what if somebody's there and even though it's a 1% or 100-year, we're seeing more of these storms on a regular basis. And it's for your own protection. This is what we try to tell them. It's for your own protection that we want to build this to today's standards. And we saw this when the maps were changing in January 29th in 2022. People were rushing to get their permits in because they didn't want to have to meet that the new standards. And I'm like, no, you should be looking at the new standards, because you don't want to build it and have it gone in 5 years. So those are the concerns we're seeing on the coastal side.
So you stole my thunder, Kim. I was going to mention in Keene, 78% of Keene is pre-76, so we deal with a lot of old buildings, and like Rye, out in the Seacoast, there's not a whole lot of new development going in for residential. Most of the lots are all built out. There are some zoning changes that are taking place now to reduce some of the surrounding rural zones, to reduce it from a 5-acre minimum to a 2-acre minimum to allow for some more development. But within this last year, we've seen, on average, the 22 years I've been here, anywhere from 5 to 7 homes a year. That's about it for new homes. But we deal with a lot of commercial permits, because Keene is really the hub for Southwest New Hampshire. So everybody comes here, they shop here, they got the hospital here, they do business in Keene. And so during the night, we're about 26,000, and during the day, we're up to 80,000. So it's a big swing, from night to day. So a lot of people live or reside outside of Keene, but use Keene for commercial. So that we deal with a lot of improvement. A lot of the commercial development is actually in a lot of the floodplain in the bowl or the valley of Keene. Most of the residential is built up on the hillsides or on the edges in West Keene or up on the hill, which again, you deal with steep slopes and all the other stuff that comes in for that. But we deal with a lot with that substantial improvement, substantial damage, which is the other major part of it. Is sometimes they don't have a choice, and how do you explain that to them? Like, now you got to fill in your basement. It's not an easy conversation to have with someone that just purchased a home now in Keene. Is, minimum single family home is $300,000. I know that doesn't compare to the coast, but in Keene, that's a big jump from what it used to be. A single family home was 150, a really decent one was 199. That was considered pretty high. And again, you're buying a pre-76 home, so it's not really up to standard up to current standards. So to tell someone they just bought a house for $300,000, now they've got to eliminate their basement, is a tough conversation. But again, we because we are a CRS community, we explain that this is overall benefit for the whole community. We get a discount just because you don't want to comply with the minimum requirements. You shouldn't subject to the people that are complying with it and that receive that discount for flood insurance. So when you explain that to them, that their decisions impact a full community or could impact a full community, they say, oh, this is a program that's put in place for the good of the community. And I think that goes over better when you explain it that way. They don't seem as upset. Obviously, they're upset about losing a basement, but we try and work with them and give them as many options as possible, either through a LOMA, where they, first thing they got to do is get an elevation certificate, because we need to know what we're working with for that building, and get an elevation certificate. I know it costs money, but it's a $1,200 investment that may give you other avenues than just filling in a basement or floodproofing a commercial building, or elevating the structure. So it all starts with that elevation certificate for us in the community.
Yeah, they're definitely difficult conversations to have. And Jana, I see you down in the corner of my screen, and hoping to get your opinion on the topic too, and especially from a state level, trying to explain these requirements. So any insight you can provide would be great.
Sure. So through our program at the state, so we coordinate the National Flood Insurance Program for FEMA. We partner with them. And our role really is to provide technical assistance and training to all stakeholders in the state. So we're constantly communicating with community officials, the public, engineers, surveyors, realtors, anybody that has a question, we're answering their questions. So you're dealing with a program that comes from the federal government. As we all know, it's very bureaucratic, can be very full of acronyms and full of very technical information. So we've learned how to kind of take those regulations and kind of make it understandable for everybody. Especially when you're getting a call from a property owner that for the first time they've been introduced to the floodplain situation. They've bought a home, their lender, or they're about to buy a home, their lender is requiring flood insurance. What is this all about? Or a property owner that bought a home and wants to build. So it's just trying to find those ways of explaining to them in common terms about what exactly that they need to do and explaining why they need to do it. This is a life safety thing. So it's just finding ways to do that without the acronyms, without the very technical terminology. So it's something that I've worked on over the last 18 years and working on this program. But we're trying to find ways to help the communities explain this to their residents. And then we're also constantly working on it with our technical assistance and our training.
Awesome, thank you. And to kind of keep the idea going with best practices, and I think I've come from a municipal level and now I'm working for the state, but and I'm sure our panelists deal with it almost daily, enforcing these regulations and dealing with violations. Dave, what are some of the best practices that you found for number one, enforcing regulations, and number two, addressing violations?
Well, if I can start with the addressing violations, we're actually kind of fortunate. We don't have a huge amount of development that's currently within the floodplain. Again, a lot of the floodplain in this area is farm fields, which are protected in several different ways. We also have a lot of community members who are conservation minded, and a lot of the fields along the Connecticut River actually have conservation easements on them prohibiting development. So they will stay in their natural state in perpetuity, which is great for me. But any type of enforcement, I always try to start with just having a conversation with the landowner and saying, this is what I found, this is the violation that I see, and here are the things that we can do to fix that. And I always think, telling someone that they have a violation that needs to be fixed without some sort of discussion of how it can be fixed doesn't work well. It kind of feels heavy-handed. I always want to work with people, not against them. That's it just makes everybody happier in the long run, and it makes people feel more comfortable coming in and having discussions with me. I found I've been here about 13 years, and there were people that used to. It was a very hard time getting them to do permits. I was constantly finding properties that they were doing work on, not getting permits, and just over the years working with them, now they come in and get permits. So trying to just make the whole feel of the office approachable has been a huge help. It's a lot of work sometimes, but that's what's really worked for me. As far as best practices for doing the enforcement, again, I think start out with a gentle nudge and then work your way up to whatever needs to be done to get the enforcement done. But usually people are fairly receptive, and it doesn't take more than a gentle nudge to get them to comply, at least in my experience. Now, that's we don't have the pressure that Keene and Rye have. You guys have some intense pressure for development. I know Keene, I grew up near Keene, so I'm very familiar with Keene. I've been there many, many times. And I can understand, you have a river that runs through your downtown. That I remember it was about 10 years ago, you had a very bad flood. We don't quite have that kind of pressure. The Connecticut River, it doesn't, there are dams on the river that control a lot of that. It can come up a certain amount, but we haven't seen anything, even with the big storms. Some of the big things that we have that's caused damage have been some of these large rainstorms that just create huge amounts of runoff, and it comes down, hits the roads, and clogs all the culverts and washes out our roads. So that's something also that we have to deal with getting permitting through the state for enlarging culverts. I do a lot of work with our highway department to try to get their permitting for culverts, because we're seeing greater and greater amounts of rainfall and greater amounts of washouts because of it.
Right. Yeah, no, I think one of your tactics to address the violation, but also have a plan for guiding them through that violation is key. You don't just want to throw them a violation and say good luck, and build that relationship with them to help them through it. Right, Mike, I see you want to say something.
No, I was just going to add along, conversation is the most important. Having a conversation with someone who's in violation is important. But one thing I've learned over the years is you got to document. If I can say anything to the people here that have to deal with enforcement, making sure that after that conversation you document it, follow up with a letter or some information, so that positions change, people change, this enforcement's, not going away. It's important to document and have that information, that if you do end up next door or wherever your courthouse is, for enforcement, and having the ability and following your fee or fine schedule under 674, that gives you that ability to do the enforcement action is a critical part in looking at your ordinance, or if you're looking at putting in an ordinance, where you have the ability to do that and what those levels are. So if I could just add one thing, is just make sure that it's documented, especially for violations, because then it starts timeframes. It gives, they need to find times. We've been dealing with a couple of open violations, and the best thing we could have done is give deadlines and make them meet those deadlines. Now, can you be flexible? Has something changed or new information come up and you have the ability to move that deadline? Absolutely. But document it, so now, hey, we're giving you an extra 30 days to come up with this material, or we have another 14 days to have another meeting or come back with a solution or an engineer. Or so if those are things I could help out with on the enforcement end, document, give deadlines.
And Kim, same question to you. Down the coast, dealing with second homes and coastal communities is not an easy task.
Brendan, I am at a loss on this one, because I am not the code enforcement officer, nor am I the building inspector. So I don't get involved with the enforcement side of it. I only find out about it afterwards when we have our CAV visit or our CAV follow-up.
Right.
And I do know that the building inspector has told Jennifer and our other FEMA reps that he tries to communicate. But what I have found is that usually we find them through usually when they go to get rated. So I can't really speak to what the enforcement side of it is, since I'm on the planning side. I'm sorry.
Sure. No, that's all right. Jen, do you have any follow-up to that? Maybe a little more insight?
Sure. So sometimes it comes out of, as Kim alluded to, FEMA and the state do what they call community assistance visits, or CAVs. So we come into a community, we look at your permit documents, and we're looking to make sure that everything is compliant with what needs to be done. And on occasion, we do find some issues, and then we work with the communities to help address those violations. The town of Rye did go through a multi-year compliance case, but I think it was a really good thing. It was probably my biggest compliance issue that I had to deal with in the state, but I think it was a really good process between FEMA, the state, and the town of working through it. There were multiple property owners, each one had a different case, but I think the town, all of us worked well together and worked through that. So I think, as Mike alluded, is documentation is key to enforcement cases and keeping with deadlines. Certainly things happen on FEMA side, on the state side, on the town side, property owner side. So it can take a bit, but in the end, you can usually come to a good resolution. And it helps make the property owner safer, even if they aren't able to be brought into full compliance. So.
Thank you, Jennifer. We did in the past, and I was trying to stay forward for the current present day, but Jennifer and the town and we've had turnover for staff. Jennifer and I are the only two who are still present. We know about these. There were multiple homes, and we did have to have the discussion. You do have to fill your basement. And we had one guy who told us he has more money than God and he will fight us. Luckily, he did not, but we looked into it. You know, that's how we knew we could not give a variance to our floodplain ordinance. There's a process. You have to look at the codes, and you have to go down a very, very narrow road to get somebody off of, give them a variance. And I want to suggest, work with these homeowners, work with your town, work with your state, work with your NFIP coordinators, because you can mitigate. And it is a long, lengthy process, but it is doable. And Rye is a great example of it is doable.
It's a great add-on. Thanks, Kim. And Kim mentioned elevation certificates earlier. Dave, how do you utilize FEMA's elevation certificate? Yeah, just kind of a catch-all. It's kind of a process, but yeah, if you could just give a brief rundown of how you utilize it, that'd be great.
Mainly I use it when we have a tear down or some sort of new construction. We use that to, first of all, ensure that the first floor is going to be where it should be as far as elevation goes. And it's a good starting point, and it kind of keeps everybody in the process, so that when the homeowner puts in their foundation, caps it, then I try to have them have that first, before they start any of the framing, any of the construction, have that elevation certified. And then we know we're all starting from the right place. That way, I've had people say, well, once it's all done, we can get that certification done. And I want it done ahead of time, because I don't want any mistakes made. I don't want you to have to go back and tear down stuff just so that you can bring it up again. It's again, explaining to people that doing it right the first time is a lot cheaper than doing it a second time. And so, like I say, I like to have the elevation certificates done right after the foundation is set and they've capped whatever they're going to, so that we know where the first floor is going to be.
Right. And Mike, I imagine it's a similar answer, but I'd love to hear your perspective on
it. Same. And just explaining, I mean, when you're dealing with new development and you're dealing with a bunch of different people, right? You're dealing with the contractor, you're dealing with the homeowner, you're dealing with the the site developers that understand, the engineers who may apply for the permit, but they may not be pushing that information on to the site GC. So it's important to, if you have inspectors, to let them know, hey, this is why we plaster these the files, letting them know that, hey, this is one of those ones you're going to have that special conversation and make sure that it's on the inspection card, and explain exactly when those points need to be hit. So we do the same thing, foundation, because that's really where everything starts. If stuff has to move or be elevated, now's the time to address that before a whole building is up, because then we're going to try to do something else like flood proofing, and then they're not meeting the minimum standards. Again, there's no variance for the building code, and there's no variance for our floodplain. Really, it just comes down to interpretation. You can, if the applicant feels that we're not interpreting it to their development, then they can appeal it to the Building Code Review Board or the local Building Code Review Board. But you really don't want these going to the zoning board, because they have no idea what, you know, what the standards are for floodplain. You're going to sit there for 45 minutes explaining, you know, what it is, and they're still, you know, they're either attorneys or real estate agents that sit on the zoning board and have no idea what the floodplain is. That, yeah, we know the water rises, but we don't know how to address it. And really, to give that opportunity for variance is tough. You know, Keene is very, you know, we know that we flood about every 5 years, and over time it's gotten less and less. You know, from about 2003, which was 3 and 9 were our worst ones, where we had about 40% of buildings affected in the city of Keene by a flood event. So that's a huge number, and it disrupts everything for weeks and weeks and weeks after the flood recedes. And dealing with making sure power can get put back on, it strains a lot of resources. So if you can get those things addressed ahead of time, so that that building will not be affected by an event, that's the best way to do it. And again, talking with the applicant up front and having that conversation, especially for commercial projects and new single family, go to the site, make sure your building inspector's involved, so that they understand that there's going to be this little extra step in getting the elevation certificate. It's pretty standard. We don't have a lot of kickback here in Keene. They know this is the point where it needs to be done, and most of the developers that are involved in it try to stay in contact with the general contractors to make sure that that happens, because we not only write it on the site plan, but we also write it on the building permit as well as a floodplain permit. So there's 3 different areas where they can say, oh, I had no idea. No, it's here, here, and here. So you can't miss it. So it just helps. But again, putting it in the forefront on your applications, you know, even stamping the permit itself saying floodplain on it will make them aware when they post that on a building that, hey, what do we got to do for this floodplain, when they hand that permit to the builder. It may be helpful. So.
Just add, you know, Lyme, we're a very small town. I am building and zoning. That's it. There's nobody else here that takes care of this. One of the things I do is on the permit itself, I have a section for conditions. And so if I require a elevation certificate, I can put that right on the permit. And so when I issue the permit, it's there and they know it has to happen. And they're, you know, not only me telling them, but there's also it's right there on the permit.
Great. Yeah, good tactic. And Kim, last but not least in this input.
So for, you know, as the planner, we've been very fortunate to have a consistent zoning board and planning board. And for the longest time, we used to have attorneys who come in and would present to our zoning board and said, FEMA's flood ordinance. And I would say, no, it's RISE floodplain ordinance, RISE. And so we have a really good zoning board that says, Kim, what's the rules? What's going on? So I've been educating them over the years, and I actually have, you can't see it because we're on the screen, but we have a zoning board meeting this coming Wednesday, and one of the applications, and I always put on the bottom of every what the relief they need. I say property is in the general residence, coastal overlay district, and special flood hazard zone AE8. So it is noticed right on the legal notice that gets sent out to abutters, sent to the Portsmouth Herald, and the property owner and the Board of Adjustment know. So our board has come in. So if it's a tear down and rebuild, or in this case, they're building, we don't have a lot, but it is a vacant property. They want to see that elevation certificate. They want to know, are you putting in an elevation certificate? They want to know where the grade is. Where are you building up from that grade? So this has been a long time in the making, but those elevation certificates have become important. We're not going to give any variance relief to the floodplain ordinance, but if you are going to be granted to build in this area, our zoning board wants to know that it's being built properly.
Great, thank you. And looking at the time, I do want to leave a few minutes for questions and answers. I did have one last question about higher standards, but I know Katie Paight is going to be covering that in her presentation. And maybe Jen, I'll look for guidance from you if you're okay with just moving to questions and answers from the audience. I think we have about 10 minutes before we should head to Katie's presentation. I think that should be enough time if anyone has questions.
Yep, that sounds good.
All right, well, we will open it up. If anybody has any questions, either raise their hand and we'll call on you, or put them in the chat. If not, I can ask my final question.
And I'll just, Brendan, I'll just want to go back to the, while we're waiting to see if there's questions about the
Yeah,
elevation
absolutely.
certificate. The elevation certificate is a best practice as it is. The minimum standard for the National Flood Insurance Program is that communities keep as-built data on file. It doesn't say how you do it, but we've always encouraged communities to use the elevation certificate. The city of Keene is in a community rating system, so they are required to keep elevation certificates. Rye was in CRS, so they've just continued that process. And it's great to hear that Lyme is doing that. And I think this is what are the best blend of everything of what's going on in New Hampshire is we have very rural communities that don't have building inspectors. Some of them don't even have zoning. So it's great to hear from Dave of kind of what their best practices are, because a lot of our communities in the state are similar to Dave and Lyme in that they don't have a lot of flooding going on. They don't have a lot of development going on, but they have a lot of great best practices. And then Mike is a good example with a building inspector in a larger community, and Ken is a good example of a coastal community. So I think I saw something come up. So
Yeah, we do have one from our very own Kirsten Howard, Resilience Program Coordinator for DES. And Mike, this one is for you. I'd love to hear more about how Keene enforces compensatory storage, and maybe some thoughts from Jen or Kim if compensatory storage will be possible to enforce in coastal communities. So Mike first, and then hit the second part with Jen and Kim.
So like dealing with the floodplain, it's really, you're relying on data that's provided to you. You're not doing, you're just verifying and getting information from the engineers, and it's not something that a homeowner can put together and present to you and you're crunching numbers. The compensatory storage is, if you're filling in a foot, you're taking out a foot. It's a no net loss for Keene's ordinance, and it's done well. We have seen reduction in certain areas after we started doing this back in, I want to say that came into play in 2008 or maybe 2010. After, I know we were working on it before the big flood, and then afterwards it became enforced. it's engineering data that you're looking at. You're verifying that there's no net loss. So whatever they're filling in, that they're depressing in another area in the lot that allows for that compensatory storage. I hope that helps answer a little bit of the question.
We don't do a lot with compensatory storage in Rye because it's mostly for floodway, and floodways are basically your riverines and your rivers. What we're seeing in Rye is the infringements upon the ocean or marsh. We have talked about it with the Zoning Board of Adjustment and the Planning Board as to how should we regulate compensatory storage. And so we're very interested in hearing more. But we don't have, believe it or not, a floodway in Rye. So I would love to hear more from Jen, and thank you, Michael, for sharing.
Yeah, so compensatory storage is not a requirement through the NFIP. So we only have 3 communities in the state that have compensatory storage requirements specifically to floodplain regulations. Keene, Raymond, after the flood events in 2006 and 2007, they adopted similar regulations as what Keene has. And then also the town of Salem also has compensatory storage requirements. So it's really geared towards addressing that storage issue. So if you have a lot of development, if you have a river running through the middle of your town, it is a good opportunity to help relieve whatever is being placed in that floodplain to take an equal amount out of that. So I'm not sure about the coastal. That is a good question, Kirsten. I'll have to, I'm going to make a note about looking at that from other states to see if they have that in their coastal communities.
Thank you for that explanation about all 3. That all sounded great. And the coastal and the floodway, that's an interesting one, Kim. I didn't realize Rye didn't have one. So yeah, all that. I mean, I don't see anything else in the chat or any raised hands. We have a few more minutes until, or at least scheduled, Katie's presentation. So I figure I can ask my last question, and it's specific to higher standards. And Dave, we haven't heard from you in a few minutes, so I'm wondering if Lyme has any higher standards for floodplain regulations, and if you don't, maybe what barriers might stop you from applying some more.
We do not have any higher standards. We do have a separate floodplain district that we look at, but it just looks at it or points back to the standards from FEMA. So we, technically don't. At the moment, the minimum standards seem to be working well for us. And again, we're kind of unique. We don't have any commercial development in any of the floodplains. We don't have any. It's all residential development, and in the most part, it's set back. There's not a huge amount of it. So even people trying to rebuild, it doesn't quite make sense to have higher standards at the moment. I think it's something that we will continue to monitor. Again, with global climate change, we're seeing much larger storm events, and so we absolutely want to keep that in mind. But at the moment, the minimum standards seem to be working well for us.
Great. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry, I like to talk, so you can shut me up anytime. But one of the things that really helped us recently in our ordinance was with the substantial damage, substantial improvement. Again, Keene 78% of Keene is pre-76. So we deal with it a lot, or have to look at it a lot with permits that are being done or anything that's being done in the or damage that's done in those locations. And under our ordinance, we didn't have at the time a set date for when does that 50% come into play. right? So is it for the history when it was built in 1829? It's certainly 50% more nowadays than it was at that time that it was built. So one thing that we put in the ordinance, helpful or not, was we did it 5 years back, right? So whatever the appraised value was up to 5 years back, we put a date on it, and really to give us a starting point. And it's come a lot different. Like I was explaining, is homes are a lot more expensive than they used to be. So to hit that 50% mark, where people are wanting to do improvements to their homes, how far back do you go to get that value or increased value of 50%? So we actually put in our ordinance, when we adopted the new land development code in 2 years ago, that we put it as a 5-year mark, just to help everybody understand, these are the numbers we're going with, and everything should be reasonable within that 5 years versus going back to 1980. Certainly the cost of doing things, from 1980 to 2022 is substantially more. So I don't know if that's helpful to communities, but that was one thing that we struggled with in this community, was determining that substantial damage, substantial improvement.
And I think if one community is struggling with it, there's got to be more. And Kim, a couple questions came into the chat, but a brief elevator speech for any higher standards in the town of Rye.
So I can speak to both of those questions that came in on the chat, but I'm going to talk to
take standards. That away. Yeah.
So higher standards, we do have the 2-year, 2-foot freeboard we put in before the building code was amended. And we are actually, Michael, thank you, because we are actually having the discussions with Jennifer Gilbert and with Katie right now as to trying to change. We've had 3 or 4 different building inspectors since I've been here. And there was never really a process, and nobody ever said what they did. So the current building inspector really didn't have a time frame, and was going, from like the history of since the beginning it was built. And as you said, we've got a lot of 1800, 1900 structures. So we are working with Jennifer Gilbert and Katie to putting in 10 years, but I'm curious, I want to go back and look at your 5-year language. We have a floodplain management manual, which needs to be updated. I wrote it in 2009. The select board approved it in 2010. And so we need to update that manual and then get it, whether we want to put it in the floodplain ordinance, the building code, or the zoning ordinance. We have to figure that out for next year's, so we can get it on the ballot to get it voted in by the people. As for one of the questions, I think, was by Matthew Thorne, do planners intersect with emergency managers? I could answer that because I'm
actually,
also...
Kim, if I could just jump in before you answer that, Mike might have had a response.
Oh,
I did. I would keep it out of the building code. Currently under RSA 155A, any changes to the building code now has to be presented to the building code review board. So I would keep it in the floodplain ordinance and not mess with the building code. One, we want to try, as as a member of the building code review board, we're trying to be consistent throughout the state of New Hampshire. And if you do make the change, it only has to be posted on the state website under the Department of Safety Building Code Review Board, so that all architects and engineers can go to one website and know how to build in that community. So either it's the minimum state standards, that everybody plays by the same rules, or if you have additional higher regulatory standards, you can go to the Building Code Review Board website and see what those are. Currently, right now, Nashua has it posted on there. Portsmouth has theirs posted on there. So if there are things that exceed the building code requirements, they would need to be posted on that website. You can't have anything that's less than the minimum requirements, but anything that is, communities are required by law under this past, when the 2018s got adopted, to put those ordinances or higher regulatory standards, like Durham goes by the newest energy code, right? So they have to look at those requirements as to the two, which ones are more stringent, right? So, currently the state of New Hampshire is under 2018. but the Durham is under the 2021 code requirement. So I just wanted to add that I would stick with it in the ordinance because then there's no, you're not changing the building code. And I can help with that if you need any help.
Because since I'm not a building inspector, I follow the ordinances for the planning and zoning. So that was great news. Thank you very much for sharing. And then there was the question from Matthew Thorne. I am also an emergency on the emergency management team. So we are very unique here in Rye in that I coordinate with the emergency management director, who also happens to be our chief of police. And so we work together with the building departments. I've been through 4 now all hazard mitigation updates. And we really bring in the last hazard mitigation update. We even brought in the planning board chair and the zoning board chair. So we do have interdepartment reviews on the all hazard mitigation plan. So it is incorporated. So we do know where the special flood hazard zones are and where the not difficulties, but we want to also bring in where there might be some areas of concern. This latest all hazard mitigation plan, we even brought in the superintendent of the Rye Water District and the sewer commissioner. And thanks to this recent all hazard mitigation plan, the Rye Sewer Commission has now put together its own plan and realized they're working with, they got a grant, they're working now to bring all of their pump stations up to code because they didn't realize that, they had some of them in the special flood hazard area and there were some things that they needed to do and they went and got a grant. So I don't know about other towns, but we in Rye do, luckily because I'm the planner and on the emergency management team, I do coordinate. So I can't speak for other towns.
Dave, can you
I can
speak for
jump
your
in
town?
also on that one. Again, Lyme is a very small community. So when last time we did the hazard mitigation plan, and we're up for an update here pretty soon, all departments are brought in, but we have a highway department that consists of 4 people. Our fire department is all volunteer. We have 2 officers in our police department. So we try to bring in as many people as possible with many different perspectives when we do an update. So we do try to do as much cross departments as possible, just because everybody has their own special knowledge of the town. And so it helps bringing in absolutely everybody, but that's a small group of people because there just aren't that many of us.
Right. And Mike, how about Keene? Any involvement or interdepartmental coordination with emergency management?
So it's evolved over many, many years of trial and error. Technology has come a long way, and part of being in this ARS program is that you have to include public works and you have to show your plan for maintaining catch basins and tax ditches and all that other stuff. As far as the development end of things, we have in the community development department, we used to be separated from planning. Now we're all one, health, code, zoning, building and planning, right? So we have for new projects every month we meet with developers for every department in the city of Keene. So we have police, fire, planning, zoning, building, floodplain, health, all of those things get included, and all the people that specialize in those areas meet with a developer. And we kind of shotgun them on what could potentially be pitfalls in the development that they're proposing, or things that they have to either go to zoning board for, or this project going to require planning, either minor review or major review from the planning board, as well as we've really been able to integrate any development project into our iWork system, which is our permitting software, to notify whenever we get a permit. We send out emails to we need a driveway permit from Public Works. We need a new address from Public Works. We We send out for planning if there were any special site plan conditions. We send them emails and they have to comment and approve, and fire department, not so much police department, they don't get involved in a lot of the building development end of things, except for traffic studies and so on and so forth in the beginning of a major development. But we've been able to do that through technology, and it's been great. And then setting up that pre-submission meeting has been great, because you get to hear about other departments that do different things, and being able to hear, and if you see something, you can say, oh, you're really going to go need to talk to them about this. Even if someone is up at the counter or makes a phone call, you should really start here. And that to developers and new homeowners and is great, because then they can get it all up front, and they're not getting that process where they've gone 10 steps forward, now they got to go 2 steps back. So if you can address things up front and really collaborate with the different departments, it's a once a month meeting that really saves the whole city a whole lot of headache. And really, did you go talk to public? Oh yeah, I talked to public works. Or did you go talk to? Oh yeah, I talked to. You know, this gets everybody in the same room and on the same page with the same project, that, you know, because they may have changed it when they went to go talk with them. So that's really where this process has helped collaborate and get everybody together. I would encourage it. Also, technology has come a long way. To be able to send emails and get that information and have everybody's comments in one location on one project really helps. So
Absolutely.
if you can integrate that, it'd be good.
That's a great suggestion. And with a couple minutes left before we jump into the Office of Planning and Development's presentation, we have one final question directly for Kim. What does RISE set as the certain time period during which repairs, reconstruction, alteration, or improvements are tracked for substantial improvement? Is there a best practice?
No, right now it's for the life of the property, of the structure, and we're struggling with that. So we're in the process of trying to change that. We have talked to Jennifer about 10 years, but we may be changing that. I want to look at Keynes to maybe 5 years. So right now it's really been per the building inspector at his discretion. So we don't have a good process, and I'm sorry to say that.
I'll just add that Newcastle also adopted a 5-year period last year. So now we have 2 communities in the state that have that.
Great. Good to hear. All right. Well, I don't see any further questions and no other hands raised. So with that, I want to thank our panelists for taking the time this morning. I know I told you all an hour, but the discussion was just too rich. I couldn't let you go. So we appreciate it. Kim, Mike, and Dave, we got a few claps coming in. And feel free to stick around for Katie's presentation. There's going to be a Q&A for OPD specific on the back end of this. But I know you all have your own day-to-day work to get to. So again, I appreciate everything, and thanks for taking the time today.
You're welcome.
All right, Katie, it's all yours.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here and listening today. At this part of our webinar, Jennifer Gilbert, who has obviously been on the panel, she's introduced herself. You've already heard her speak today. Her and I are going to be presenting on some best practices that we have and that we recommend to communities as well. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Katie Paight, and I am the State Floodplain Management Program Coordinator, and I work with Jen, and we administer the NFIP in New Hampshire. So here's just a brief agenda of our presentation coming up. I'm going to start with just a one-slide overview of the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, just in case there's anybody on the call who maybe isn't as familiar as a lot of us are. Following that, the majority of our presentation is going to be giving best practices and ones that we can give off and give those resources to you. And then at the end, Jen will also be speaking briefly about the flood provisions in the state building code as well. So again, I just wanted to start real quick with one slide in case anybody here wasn't as familiar as, quite a few of us are with the NFIP. So the NFIP, again, the National Flood Insurance Program, is a voluntary partnership between FEMA and then participating communities. And those communities do, as it's voluntary, they do voluntarily join. So when they join, communities agree to adopt local floodplain regulations that do meet the minimum requirements of the program, and then they enforce those regulations through the local permitting process. And then in return, flood insurance is made available for all property owners, renters, and businesses in the community through that National Flood Insurance Program. So let's go through briefly the responsibilities that a participating community has. So first, the community must adopt floodplain management regulations that meet or exceed the minimum requirements of the program. This is done when the community joins the program, though over time there are opportunities or there's points when the community might even make amendments or they choose to adopt higher standards. Communities are responsible to administer a permit process for all development in a flood zone, and those flood zones are called special flood hazard areas, as we've heard many times already on this call today. Those special flood hazard areas, those are the areas indicated on the FEMA flood insurance rate map as the 1% annual chance flood. And so that permit process for any development occurring in those special flood hazard areas, that applies to both building development and non-building development as well. Communities are also responsible to make a floodplain determination for all development projects. So again, when an application or somebody comes in, it's asking that question, is this located in the floodplain? Communities are responsible to ensure that all the development in those special flood hazard areas is in compliance with the community's floodplain regulations. And that not only includes standards for new development, but also includes making those substantial improvement and substantial damage determinations for existing development that's already there. You heard many of our panelists, talk about that briefly this morning as well, and best practices with that. Once a project that did occur in the special flood hazard area, once that project is complete, the community is responsible to ensure that the development met the community's floodplain regulations, meaning they built to how they said they would build and make sure they're meeting those regulations. And that also includes obtaining documentation and maintaining that documentation on file as well. And then lastly, the community is responsible for addressing any violations of their floodplain regulations, and that's just through the community's enforcement procedures, just as they would for any other zoning violation. I'm sorry if you can hear that ringing. My desk phone's ringing right now. So adoption and enforcement of floodplain regulations that meet minimum NFIP requirements is obviously a requirement for the community to remain in good standing with the program. That being said, even when a town or a city's regulations are followed, even if they're followed to a T, it doesn't mean that those areas are completely safe from flooding. Buildings can still suffer damage or experience effects from flooding. So reasons for this could include changes to the floodplain since the last issuance of the flood maps. So any development or non-building development that has occurred that would change the way that water would flow during a flooding event, that could obviously cause damage to structures. Additionally, larger and more severe floods can and do happen. As I noted a second ago, those flood insurance rate maps that are produced by FEMA, those really map the 1% annual chance flood, but obviously, and as it's clear in New Hampshire, larger floods can happen and they have happened in the past. Additionally, again, those flood maps, they do not account for any future conditions. So that includes any future conditions such as changing weather patterns or effects of climate change. They really just show the representation of risk at the time that those maps were created. So for this reason, there are several communities throughout New Hampshire that have chosen to adopt higher standards that do go on the minimum requirements, so to better protect those properties from the effects of flooding. We heard, from our three communities today, Rye and Key both have adopted higher standards to do that as well. So our office, the New Hampshire Floodplain Management Program, we have developed a model ordinance which contains the minimum regulations that a community must adopt in order to participate in the NFIP. Many communities in New Hampshire have adopted this or an older version of this ordinance. And when we say minimum, just so everyone's aware, that is the regulations that are outlined in Title 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations. But that being said, we always encourage communities to adopt more stringent floodplain regulations that go beyond the minimum requirements. As adopting these types of standards can improve a community's resiliency to future floods. You know, we've heard our panelists talk about that today. You know, you're really helping the community as a whole by having those higher standards and higher level of protection. So for this reason, we have created a model ordinance that has higher standards with administrative procedures, as well as a menu of higher floodplain regulation standards for communities to use. So the model ordinance includes administrative procedures for tasks required with the program, such as permitting and making those substantial improvement and substantial damage determinations. And then the menu of higher floodplain regulation standards provides examples of recommended higher regulations that could be adopted a la carte, so to say. So a community could choose 1, 2, 3, or all of them, or whatever fits well for their community and the needs of that specific community. Within that menu of higher standards, each of the higher standards also includes sample ordinance language for each standard, as well as links and resources for how to learn more about what that higher standard is. And then it also includes the CRS. So for the community rating system, it includes how many credits would be available if that was adopted. So if the community is either in CRS or they're looking to get into CRS, you would be able to see what kind of points you could get for that as well. So at this point, I think I'm going to hand control over to Jen, and she's going to talk about some of those best practices as well.
Okay, thanks, Katie. So now we'll move on to the guidance and best practices for effective local floodplain management program. Our office developed this guidance and best practices, and its goal is really to assist communities in having an effective, compliant, and consistent procedures in place. As Katie mentioned, we developed a model ordinance that included many of these administrative procedures, but we also produced this standalone. So if communities didn't want to adopt it into your ordinance, we would have these procedures that could be adopted by the community. And really, these procedures are really to help guide you with the processes that you need to do to be compliant with the NFIP. So I'll be talking more about the top 5 topics that we talk about in these administrative, in this guidance document. But the last 3 are, we don't really address these, but I'll address them now. As far as floodplain development or variances, as you've noted from the panel discussion, in general, we don't like to see variances from the floodplain regulations. It is a life safety based ordinance, but that we recognize that there could be extenuating circumstances. So there are 3 additional requirements for a variance from a floodplain regulation beyond the 5 required state variance criteria. If you're interested in learning more, our office is having our annual Planning and Zoning Conference on April 29th. And one of the sessions is me talking about floodplain variances. If you can't make that, we are recording it, and we'll be posting information about where it being on our YouTube channel following the conference. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned for that. We talked a lot about floodplain development enforcement process during our panel discussion. It is in state statute. It's the same thing as what you would do with any other zoning ordinance. So we've already discussed that. Records, as a participating community of the National Flood Insurance Program, communities are required to keep records of determinations that they make from regards to their floodplain regulations, and in perpetuity as part of your participation in the program. All right, so we'll start out talking about the administrative procedures that we've talked about that are in our model ordinance. And really, this is just something that our office had put together just based on my experience working with community over my time doing this program. It's really to ensure community adherence and consistency for all properties. Some communities are dealing with floodplain development every day. Some are not dealing with it very often. It's kind of here and there. So sometimes it's forgotten how you did the last permit for one property to the next property, specifically to floodplains. So these administrative procedures can include all the responsibilities related to a community's participation in the NFIP. I've also seen a lot of turnover in communities. I've kind of helped communities set up a permit process. And then 6 years later, I'm back with new staff doing kind of the same thing. So this is kind of a way to get it written down, to detail what your procedures are for your community. So if you do have a staff change, it can be a seamless transition to be used at. And again, every community is different. Every community's flood risk is different. Every community's staffing is different. Every community has different levels of building inspection or zoning. So this certainly can be customized for each community. And then also inland versus coastal communities, there can be a difference there as well. So we have templates for both cases. And these are available on our website. We'll be talking about where our website is at the end. Public outreach is a big piece of it. Again, depending on your community and how often you're dealing with floodplain development, we have some communities that participate in the program that do not have other zoning. So this may be their only permitting process. So it's important for their residents to understand that there are regulations in place for floodplain development. So we've put together some kind of sample templates to help get the word out to your community about the fact that you have floodplain regulations. So we have, posters or just things that you can put up in town hall or put into a usual mailing, just to let people know that you do have floodplain regulations and they do need to come in for permitting. So we have that information available too. So that's an important piece, not only about the regulations, but just to keep periodically reminding residents that there is chance of flood risk in your community. And so if they don't have a lender requiring them to have flood insurance, they may not be thinking about that. So it's important just to keep your residents aware of the potential for flood risk. All of our panelists kind of talked about how they deal with floodplain determinations. As Dave mentioned, GIS, that's probably one of the biggest ways that you can kind of make a determination. Our office has the New Hampshire Flood Hazards Viewer. That is a tool that can be used by communities to help you make that determination. In many cases, we have the parcel level data that's available in the state on our viewer, so that can help you as well. All of FEMA's maps, except for Belknap County, are in digital format. So those GIS layers are available, and some communities have incorporated that into your online assessor's database. So that's, again, another way that you can help make that determination. But communities ultimately are responsible for making sure that if someone's coming in to do something, that you're making a determination whether or not it's in the special flood hazard area or not. So there are many different ways that you can set that up based on what your resources are in your community. The floodplain development, every community that has a floodplain regulation has a statement that all proposed development in a special flood hazard area requires a permit. And if you look at the definition for development, it's development is very broad. It doesn't just include buildings, it also includes non-building development. So if someone's bringing in fill, it's a way for a community to know how much fill is being brought in, whether or not there's anything in the ordinance that will require some compliance to be done with that fill. So we highly recommend that communities have a floodplain development permit. You can use your building permit as kind of a starting point, but if it triggers, but it's just to account for those cases where you don't have a building, that you have a permit process in place to deal with the non-building development. And I know that we have several communities in the state. Rye has one, City of Lebanon has one. You can use our template or you can use whatever application format that you want to use. It's just important to have that permit application for that non-building development. And we are happy to work with communities on developing a permit application. We've done that in the past. So again, just please feel free to reach out to us. We talked about elevation certificates during the panel discussion. Again, I mentioned it was a best practice. It's not required under the NFIP, but it is a good thing to have. It can also be used for other purposes other than community compliance. It can also be used for flood insurance purposes, or if someone wanted to seek a relief from being in the floodplain, if they know that their property is on land that's higher than the base flood elevation or 100-year flood elevation, they can seek to get removed from the floodplain. It relieves them from flood insurance purposes with a lender and from community floodplain regulations, but it doesn't necessarily relieve them from the flood risk, but it is an option out there that an elevation certificate can be used. And just a note that FEMA is currently working on updating the elevation certificate. Once that has been released, we will let everybody know about that. There are some big changes in the elevation certificate because the elevation certificate is now addressing the new flood insurance methodology that FEMA implemented about a year or two ago. So those are the couple of the changes that are being made to the elevation certificate. Substantial improvement and substantial damage determinations. We talked a little bit about that during the panel. This is probably the most complicated and sometimes confusing process of your floodplain regulations. This is the 50% rule that Kim talked about. Is if someone is improving their structure and the total cost of those improvements are greater than equal to or greater than 50% of the market value of the structure itself. If that is 50% or more, then full compliance of the floodplain regulations are then required. So there are a lot of different steps and a lot of different things that you have to be aware of when it comes to substantial improvement and substantial damage. So we've put together an application packet with an substantial improvement, substantial damage application, just to help communities walk through those steps of what needs to be done. It's also, we also put together a property owner information guide to kind of help property owners understand the process and why a community needs to ask them for all this information. So it's kind of transparent for both the community official and the applicant in the substantial improvement, substantial damage process. So again, that is available on our website if you want to take a look at that. It's customizable for the community. We just have the template to get you started. I'm happy to work with any communities that want to set something up. We've mentioned before that the state has adopted the 2018 codes as of July of last year. There are flood provisions in those state building codes that exceed the minimum standards of the NFIP. So we just want to make communities aware that, because many communities have adopted the minimum standards of the NFIP, but the state building code requires all buildings to be compliant with the state building code. We realize that communities have different levels of enforcement of the state building code. If you don't have a building inspector, it falls to other people to enforce that. But just to be aware, FEMA has a great comparison of the NFIP and the 2018 I codes. It's a great graphical representation of kind of the differences between it. Not sure if you can see that graphic at the bottom. That represents the freeboard requirements, or under the minimum NFIP standards, the lowest floor of a structure has to be elevated at least to the base flood elevation, which is the 100-year flood elevation. In the state building code for residential structures, you have to elevate that lowest floor at least 1 foot above that base flood elevation. So that is one key difference that we do have in the state now, that all buildings in a special flood hazard area has to at least meet that standard. Some of the other things that the flood provisions are higher standards in the state building code that are not in the NFIP requirements mostly deal with this coastal areas themselves. When FEMA remapped the coastal area of the state in 2021, it does now include a feature called the limit of moderate wave action. So this is an additional feature for the communities that are directly along the Atlantic coast. These communities already have velocity zones labeled as zone VE. So this indicates areas where there's wave action 3 feet or greater. The limit of moderate wave action indicates an area between that velocity zone and that limit of moderate wave action where the waves are 1.5 feet to 3 feet. FEMA has done studies that have shown that damage can be caused to buildings up to 1.5 feet of wave action. So they have delineated this on the coastal maps. And the state building code acknowledges these, what they call coastal A zones, which are delineated by this limit of moderate wave action. So if you can see on this slide, there's the black line that has the little flag indications. This is the limit of moderate wave action. This is not the same of what the maps look like, but this is a kind of a cartoon version of it. So any area between that area and that VE, they're mostly delineated as coastal. They're delineated as zone AE areas, but when they are within that area of the coastal A zone, even though they're AE, the building code requires that buildings be built to VE standards in those areas. So that's, we have a summary of when the 2015 codes went effective, and then also a summary of the 2018 code. There weren't a lot of changes when the 2018 codes went into effect, but we have that information available on our website as well for more details. So kind of just wrap up our brief presentation, some of the key takeaways that we want you to take away with is to make sure you have an effective permit and enforcement process for all development in special flood hazard areas. As I said, periodically the state and FEMA will do check-ins with communities just to make sure that you're doing what you need to be doing as a participating community of the NFIP. So it's really important to have that effective permit and enforcement process. And if you need to develop administrative procedures, we highly recommend that, just to ensure that you are adhering and being consistent and maintaining your good standing in the NFIP. Just have a good understanding of your floodplain regulations. And there's just, as Dave mentioned, there's a lot of good FEMA guidance materials, which we do have on our website. So just get to know that. And become familiar with your community's floodplain maps and the flood insurance study that accompanies it. Currently, we have a lot of FEMA mapping studies underway in the state, so we'll be contacting communities over the next several years as the new maps go effective. So just to be aware of that, and just being participating in any of the mapping meetings that are going to be going on up until those maps become effective. It's really important for us to hear from the communities on your input on new floodplain maps. Katie and I do a lot of training, and we record all of our trainings on our YouTube page. So if they're always available, webinars that we've conducted, if you can't make those, we do have those up on our YouTube page. We will be having another basics coming up sometime this spring. So stay tuned for that. And again, Katie and I are available to assist wherever we can. So just reach out and contact us. This is our contact information. That is our current website. As if you've been to our website, we're still under our old agency of the Office of Strategic Initiatives, but we will be migrating to our new agency at Department of Business and Economic Affairs. And that is looking like it will be, that transition will be happening on May 1st. So stay tuned for more information about that. And that is all that we have.
All right, great. Thank you. Similar setup as questions to the panelists. If anyone has questions directly for Jen or Katie, either enter them in the chat and we can address them, or feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute you. We'll say there was nothing in the chat as you were talking, so we'll see if anything pops up in the next minute or so.
I'll just note that for anybody who hasn't noticed the chat, as Jen was going through those best practices, I was putting in the links for those to our website, the direct links that can bring you to that. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's great material. And Jen mentioned all the resources that FEMA provides too. It's on the FEMA website. I mean, they have quite a substantial amount of resources and a lot of pages to go through. But I think if you ask Jen and Katie where to look, they'll be able to direct you to the specific page. I mean, I'm not seeing any. We can give it another minute while I'm kind of wrapping up and saying thank you. And Kirsten, throwing us a bone here. If you, oh, nope, not a question. Yeah, and Katie and Jen's contact information is there too. I know, and I'm speaking for them. They're always willing to help and answer any questions you have. So feel free to contact them. I will put some contact information for folks from the coastal program as well. And if you have any questions about this Flood Smart Seacoast project that we're developing and working on, then we'll put some contact information in the chat. And yeah, thank you, Kirsten, for that. Feel free to share any in the chat, any experiences you have with your own community floodplain management. Yeah, maybe you did something different that the panelists might not have done, and you have a good idea that might have helped some people out.
Yes, we
yeah,
always love hearing from people, communities of what they're doing, kind of best practices, because that really helps us to get the word out to the other communities as well.
Absolutely. It's a team effort for sure. All right. Well, I think we'll start wrapping things up. A few people signed off, and I don't see anything else working in the chat. So again, I want to thank our panelists, Mike, Kim, and Dave. I can't quite see if any of you are still on, but appreciate you taking the time and having the conversation with us. And hopefully folks were able to hear something new from our panelists and something new from Katie and Jen. Yeah, Margaret, glad you got some good information. We're going to stop recording in a minute. Thank all the attendees, obviously, for signing up. This is huge and very helpful. And thanks to Jen and Katie for that presentation and the quick rundown. I feel like this could be a whole series just specific to elevation certificates or substantial improvement and damage, those types of things. So again, if anybody has questions about anything specific, absolutely reach out. I do have a note here with the ending of this presentation, we are going to have an evaluation. Hopefully you can fill that out and give us some good feedback or negative feedback, constructive criticism. All of it's helpful. So that will be coming via email through the registration link, and you'll just get it most likely either this afternoon or tomorrow. And yeah, hopefully you can fill that out and help us out. Jen and Katie, any final thoughts that I may have missed? I think I covered it all.
I think you did great, Brendan.
All right. Yeah, and these recordings will be available on the OPD website or the OSI website. As Jen said, they're going to be transitioning in May, and also the DES YouTube channel. If you feel like distributing, there you go, to any of your colleagues or anybody that might be interested. So yeah, we appreciate everybody's time today.